Call the meeting to order, and I'll ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mr. Boomer. Mr. Booker.
Present.
Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Gurl.
Present.
Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Present.
Mr. Neighbors.
Present.
Mrs. Red. Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mr. Tassoni.
Present.
Mr. Webster. Mr. Westcott.
Present.
Mr. Arena. Mr. Billich.
Here.
19 present, 1 absent, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. With that, I will ask everybody to stand. I'll turn things over to Mr. Butita for the invocation and pledge.
Heavenly Father, we come to you today asking for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this meeting. We gather together with the intent of doing good work, and we seek to represent fairly and well those who have given us that task. May our efforts tonight be blessed with your insight, guided by your understanding and compassion for our fellow man. Please, God, we ask now that you watch over all those who defend our freedom and public safety, shield them from harm, and guide them in all their pursuits. We also ask the same for all our public employees of Winnebago County who serve us so well. As your trusted servants, we seek your blessings on our deliberations and on our efforts here tonight. May we act wisely and well. Amen. Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butita. Our next item of business is public comment. I'm going to ask Pamela Harding, who is coming to speak against the sale of recreational marijuana, to please come forward. Thanks, Pamela. And as she's coming up, I'll read our disclaimer. Comments shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers may not address a zoning matter pending before the ZBA, zoning committee, or the county board. Personnel matters or pending or threatened litigation may not be addressed in open session. An individual may speak a maximum of 3 times per calendar year on the same topic. This prohibition shall include the repetition of the same topic and a statement of what is purported to be a different topic. Personal attacks or inappropriate language of any sort will not be tolerated. And Pamela, thanks so much for coming to talk to the board, and you're up.
Thank you for allowing me to address you. Recently, our governor has legalized the sale of recreational marijuana in our state, and this is why I'm here. I stand before you as one who was plagued with addiction to drugs, but by God's grace, I'm now freed from all addictions. But because of where I was, I've seen the lives of many people destroyed because of them. I'm baffled that our state is now desiring to become a legal drug dealer. I know this is harsh, but it's reality. So what does the government then offer the solutions for these problems? Addiction centers. So this is the cause and the effect. One feeds the other and both are in greater harm's way. This is ludicrous. Marijuana is a gateway drug, and I know firsthand that smoking pot is not where it stops. Addiction is like a hook in a person's life, hence why the term being hooked on drugs comes from. It very quickly goes from not enough of a high for the user. So the cycle of looking for a greater high begins. But where will that be found? It'll be found in those drugs that are not legal. So then what happens? Legalization of marijuana is to nobody's benefit, especially the children of our community, which you all have a responsibility over in making sure that the quality of life, as far as you are able, is one of safety and protection. Addiction is far from making our children's lives better. I've seen where parents have chosen their drugs over the children, and that's what addictions do. They control you. And most of the time, they have the final say in what choices one makes, even for their own children. Rockford has just spent millions of dollars, and still are, in trying to transform Rockford, because of it making the list of worst cities in America, 16 out of 50 as of 2018. And making this county of Winnebago a legalized drug distribution county is going to do what for the city of Rockford and all the other cities in Winnebago who will be affected by the sales? Not to mention more upon our law enforcement agencies, the hospitals, who are already, dealing with drinking and driving, texting and driving, and now being stoned and driving. The cost of lives and money is astronomical. There's not one person in this place that can say that they haven't been affected in their own lives due to this. Please hear what this will add to the devastation of the people of this county. I implore you to choose making Winnebago a dry county in regard to the sale of recreational marijuana. Laws of government are in place to protect and keep people safe from their own destruction. You hold the ability to choose for the people of the county of Winnebago. Every man, woman, teenager, and child will in some way or another be affected by your choice. I pray and hope that you choose wisely for our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela, for coming to talk to the board tonight. Really appreciate your time. Our next item of business, board member correspondence. Any comments by board members? Seeing none, we'll move on to chairman's report. I have no update this evening. The next item of business, announcements and communications. I will turn to Clerk Gumau.
Mr. Chairman, the items listed below were received as correspondence.
And we will place those on file. Thank you very much. Next item of business, the consent agenda, which includes the raffle report, the bills, the approval of the July 25th, 2019 minutes, and the layover of the August 8th minutes. May I please have a motion? Thank you, Mr. Billich. May I have a second on the consent agenda? Mr. Fellers, Mr. Kelly as well. Consent agenda is now before the board for discussion or questions. Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Next item of business, department head updates. Any department head updates? Nope, thank you. I see that Dr. Martell is here, and I'm at the risk of putting you on the spot. I just wanted to open the floor if you have anything to add related to anything you could share related to any landfill updates. And maybe the update is there's updates coming in the future. Just wanted to see if you had anything, Dr. Martell. Sorry to put you on the spot.
We have a mic or she?
Oh, she's good.
Board of Health will be reconsidering next month some changes and some challenges to the legal constitutionality of the ordinance as it was put forth.
Okay, so we'll get an update on the ordinance that came forward. It went back for a little more discussion. It'll be coming back to the county board in the near future.
Correct.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Martell. Any other department head matters? Seeing none, we'll move on. Standing committee reports. Finance Committee, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll give the report. There is no report, but I do want to just make everybody aware. We met on Tuesday to kind of, we had a finance committee as alluded. The deficit, not taking into account the 20 deputies on the budget, went up to, I want to say, $4.5 million versus $3.2 million deficit. That's at no tax levy increase, no new growth. That was communicated. There was also a projection based on the 20 deputies. Believe that jumped up to 6 point something. Don't have the numbers with me. That was communicated across the board. I will reach out to Lisa to make sure she sends out those forms, though, with the 4 scenarios. It was decided that we're going to have a joint caucus, essentially, with the Democrats, Republicans, to discuss what direction the county wants to head in, whether it's tax levy remaining flat, whether it's new growth, whether it's taking the levy increase with the CPI. So those are discussions that we're going to have. It's coming down the pipeline. I just want to let everybody know and aware. If they have the questions, please ask those questions Obviously, the biggest concern is that if we continue to eat our reserves, we're looking at 8 to 12 years essentially to wipe it out if the original budget that we kind of projected. So those are the biggest concerns. Revenue is a big concern. Where do we generate more revenue on that aspect of it? So we are working on that notion. Hopefully this coming week, I believe Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not putting words in Mr. Boomer or Mr. Hoffman. We'd like to sit down and discuss as a joint caucus to make that direction so we know where our basis is so we can continue to either one, make decisions strategically, both short-term for the next budget cycle and for the future. So those are the things that we're looking at. Just wanted to update everybody on that, and we'll move forward. And hopefully next week sometime we can make direction. So by our late September 5th deadline, we can have a budget presented and then voted on the following, which would be the 20-something like that, a board meeting for the final budget. So those are our kind of information so everybody's aware. We are working. I sent the emails out that regarding last Friday. Everybody should have got a copy of the new increase of the $1.3 million deficit. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Please let Lisa and Molly in the office in the finance, and we'll try to work those areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. I saw a hand pop up. I just got a quick follow-up. So you're saying there would be a joint caucus meeting sometime next week, the week of August 26th. You don't have that specific date yet. Is that correct?
That is correct. I leave that to the chairmen of the caucus for both Democratic and Republican to make that decision. It was directed by the Finance Committee that they do so. So they're going to be reaching out to find the best date and alternative so we can have that meeting. Yes.
So people check their agenda maybe tomorrow afternoon after giving Mr. Boomer and Mr. Hoffman a little bit of time to find the best date possible. So a joint caucus meeting next week related to budget discussion. Then you said, and this has been said in prior meetings, September 5th, which would be 2 weeks from tonight, would be the special meeting to present the budget. Then it would lay over for a period of time, and then the board could take the final vote on the budget prior to October 1st. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions or follow-ups? Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a big fan of learning from my mistakes. We don't repeat them. I've heard a couple board members on the floor here and in the media relate to specific numbers of either deputies or jail staff in relation to the budget. And as per what happened last time we started talking about such figures, I would very much encourage every member of this board not to speak about any specific number of deputies, number of corrections officers, any numbers of employees, as that could be construed as attempting to determine against statute how many the sheriff can or cannot hire. It is our job simply to set a budget, whatever that budget is, and for the sheriff and for the other departments to operate within that budget. As soon as we start talking about actual numbers of deputies or other employees, that's when we go down the dark path that we got into last year, and I would highly encourage that we all measure our conversations on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Any follow-up by board members? Mr. Kelly.
I beg to differ. I believe the state statute does allow the county board to set the maximum number of deputies that can be hired.
I think we agree on the deputy count, that by statute, the county board has the authority to set deputy count. I think we're clear on that. Is that, Mr. Fellers, just want to clarify?
Yeah, sorry, to clarify, of course we're clear on that, but as it relates to any dollars spent, a certain amount of money for a certain number of deputies, right, or a certain amount of money means that you don't have those, a certain number of deputies. That was what got us into the lawsuit last year, and we should definitely make sure we avoid talking about numbers as it relates to specific dollar values.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Thank you for the follow-up, Mr. Fellers, and again, thank you, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Salgado, one follow-up. Has there been any discussion come from professional staff and or in Finance Committee related to the non-union wage increase or freeze, or any discussion on the non-union side? Typically that comes up in the process. And I was just wondering if there's been any recommendation at the staff level or any discussion in committee that's on record yet. And if not, I'm not suggesting there should be tonight. I'm just wondering if that's been broached.
I can't speak to that. My assumption is that they've taken everything into consideration, both the non-union and the union increases. And they're all baked in, the salaries, from my recollection of that. But I can't confirm unless the finance team or Carla's here to answer that specific question. But from my understanding, it has been baked in on that aspect of it, so.
Maybe what I'll do, if it's okay, is I'll drop an email to you and a couple in finance and just see if there's movement on that, or where the status of that is at. Any other discussion on the finance committee or update from Mr. Salgado? We'll look for a joint committee, joint caucus meeting next week, and then the September 5th preview of the budget or unveiling of the budget special meeting. Next item of business, zoning committee, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Chairman. Your zoning committee this evening has 4 items, all to be laid over. So with the first reading, we have Z0519, that's a map amendment. The second one on your agenda there is SU1119. That's a special use permit, and that comes with conditions. Number 3 is SU1219. That's also a special use permit, and likewise comes with conditions. And number 4 is V0319, and that's a variance, and that too comes to you with conditions. So those will be laid over until our next board meeting, September 5th, if I'm not mistaken. That's all we have.
We've read in those items, and then the next zoning committee meeting, September 5th, which is also the night of the special meeting. I'm sure we'll want to coordinate that prior to the board or the budget meeting. Next item of business is the Economic Development Committee. Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight on Economic Development, we start with a resolution concerning the policy for the process for awarding, recommending, evaluating, and approval of host fee funds to other entities.
So we have a resolution, a motion by Mr. Billick on the resolution related to the process for awarding, recommending, evaluating, and approving host fee funds. Can I have a second, please? Mr. Butita, Mr. Girl, the item is now before the board. Would you like to speak to this, Mr. Billick?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This resolution concerning the policy for the process for awarding and recommending, evaluating, approval of host fee funds is the one that we did in regards to the annual host fee funds. We had a lot of discussion in regards to this. We did have some kind of basis of an application that actually was updated. It was made so that way it was an easier way to follow and have people give something to people that they can actually fill out, so we can actually have as much information as we possibly need to make the best educated decision on it. The only thing we did hold off on for a while was actually just to make sure that we had all the wording situated. The committee had agreed with all the wording that we had in this resolution, and passed unanimously.
Any discussion by board members? Oh, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank Mr. Dornbush and his staff on all the work that has gone into putting this together and having it in front of us. With this resolution passing, I would hope that this committee and also this board would lift a moratorium on host fees so we can go back to business as usual. So I would make that recommendation, and I support this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Girl. I have a question, and I think I brought this up offline, but I just wanted to mention it. If there's any way to get this clarified, it would be helpful for my thinking and understanding of this change compared to the current ordinance. In the current ordinance adopted by the board under chairman duties, under number 2, 249 duties, number 2, It reads, represent the county on economic development opportunities, monitor and report to the Economic Development Committee, activities, proposed agreements. I guess my question is, when I read the resolution compared to how I read the ordinance, the resolution, I'm not exactly clear how I would engage in anything related to host fees. But then on the, when it's in the ordinance, actually under number 5, it says monitor the development of an annual host fee allocations to be approved by the board. I just want to make sure that the ordinance and the resolution are singing together. I'm just wondering if it does, because I see one where the role of the chairman is non-existent. I'm not sure how I would engage if this resolution passes. I'm not saying I couldn't, I'm just saying I can't point to any language that says there's a role for me. But then in the current ordinance adopted by this board, it says that I'm monitoring the development of the annual host fee allocations. So I want to make sure that I'm understanding the will of the board, and that's the extent of it.
I'd probably turn that over to legal and Chris, but as far as I'm understanding it, it was no change or any effect, wasn't really discussed as far as any changes to any of the chairmanship roles or anything like that.
Okay. Mr. Kurlenkus or State's Attorney?
I think that was made clear during the changes, so that's my comment.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Webster?
Yeah, just a quick one, and no offense, but this is a response to what Bert just said. He said we get back to normal. I hope we don't go back to normal, because normal is what got us depleting that host fee fund. So we have $35 million worth of commitments. Some of them stretch out more than 10 years. And so, once again, I'll make the same statement. In the past, we were so overly generous. We were generous to a fault by giving that money away. And a lot of that money went to other taxing bodies as well. So I hope we're cognizant of that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Any other comments by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? No. Mr. Schultz, on the no vote, we will cast a yes vote for all other members present. Mr. Arena is absent. Thank you, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next resolution is a resolution granting authority to the Winnebago County Board Chairman to execute the documents necessary to complete a loan for $17,500 from the revolving loan fund to Shorty's Kitchen, LLC.
We got a motion by Mr. Billick on the resolution granting authority to the chairman to execute the documents necessary to complete a loan for $17,500 for the revolving loan fund to Shorty's Kitchen, LLC. Can I have a second? Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Thank you, Mr. Westcott, and I think Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board for discussion. Anybody want to speak to this, or we're good? Any questions by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next resolution is a resolution supporting the siting of a casino in the city of Rockford along the I-90 corridor.
Got a motion by Mr. Billick on the resolution supporting the siting of a casino in the city of Rockford along the I-90 corridor. May I have a second, please, Mr. Gurl and Mr. Westcott? Item is now before the board. Would you mind speaking to that, Mr. Billick?
Sure. So this resolution is a resolution supporting the siting of a casino in the city of Rockford along the I-90 corridor. This had actually all started up with discussions amongst different constituents and residents in the area. What sparked it along further was the City of Loves Park and City of McChesney Park also passing a resolution. Then I was approached as far as, questioning if that's along the lines of which we were going. So I did have concerns from different constituents. I then looked into this resolution, did some homework on it, and we presented this resolution as showing support from the county on the county's end, that we show support for what we believe is going to be the best revenue creating location, not a specific location, but in general, and that's why I kept it very loose. Obviously, it is on the city to make the decision, and picking any Bender or anything like that, and I wanted to make sure that we stayed away from any of that conversation. Also, with the timing of this resolution, it was actually more along the lines of I didn't want this, the county board to look as though we are making a suggestion towards one casino or another, or any operators or anything like that. More along the lines of just the general conversation of which we've had as far as being the most, what we believe is going to be the most profitable area to put it in.
Any follow-up, any questions by board members? I know there was some discussion in committee. Mr. Hoffman, then I see Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Hoffman.
Thanks, Chairman. I had a long talk with my wife, who's an alderman, and I decided I'm going to recuse myself on this, not having an idea either way, really, but I don't want it to reflect on her position as an alderman.
So we'll note that for the record. Mr. Hoffman's going to recuse himself from this vote. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Mrs. Crosby had her hand up.
Am I on? Thank you. Number one, I think the fact that we're citing the I-90 corridor kind of lets the cat out of the bag. And it does suggest that we are leaning towards a specific applicant. Secondly, which is more important to me, I object to the process. The applications aren't due until the end of August. There'll be public presentations provided. The applications to the state aren't due until October 25th, and I just think we're premature in voting on this at this juncture. The city is our biggest neighbor and our biggest partner, and I'd like to give them the respect and allow them to go through the process before we jump on the bandwagon. So I object to the resolution for those reasons. I'm not about location, I'm just about process.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Any other discussion by board members? Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to echo what Mrs. Crosby said here. It is our job here, I think, as a board to make sure that we keep a fair and open competition. Right, we want to make sure that people coming in for bids have a fair and open process, that we are getting that the city is getting the best bids they can of it wherever the location is, and weighing at this time certainly lays our finger on the scale of which way this board thinks it should go. It doesn't mean that we can't do it somewhere else. I understand that, but at this point, there's still so much out there. All we've had is a committee meeting of public comments. We haven't had representatives representing any site that's been recommended come and speak to this board. We've not seen any data, so we're making an opinion-based decision. We think that this might be the right location, but there are lots of people with opinions, and we've not seen any data on the subject. No one has actually presented us and said, you know, that there's a reason why we would recommend this site over the other, there's a reason why we recommend this site over the other. We are simply operating very rapidly ahead of schedule, and unfortunately, the only outcome here is that we either, you know, we've got to this point where it's become a binary decision. You know, my biggest fear is that if we say we support this resolution, it means that yes, this board supports I-90. Or if we say we don't, or it goes down, you know, 11 to 8 or 10 to 8 or 10 to 9, however it is, in favor of the other one, we'll be saying, no, we don't want out there at I-90. Right? We've now put ourselves in this binary situation when there's a long process to go, and we should let that process play out. Let the people that are experts in this come to us, present to this board as a whole, you know, from the podium up there, show why one location and his better than the other, or why they think this location, and here's the data to back that up. And then we can make a good measured decision instead of rushing forward and jumping into something. So I will be voting no unless someone moves to lay this over so that we can have a real conversation about the right location for a casino in this community.
And if I may respond to that.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. We'll go to the chair of this committee, and then I see a couple of hands popped up. Mr. Billick.
Just as a response to that, and I understand, obviously, people wanted to get more data. One of the things that I did, and I tried to make sure I did, I got the ball rolling and started a conversation with a lot of my committee members earlier on. It was about a month and a half, maybe a month in advance, and I tried to give as much time. I also did make sure that we laid it over just so we can actually make sure that we can get some more information on it. During that time, I did do, like I said, I did do some studying up on it. We look at other communities, for example, like Aurora, which is possibly going to be offering money, which I shouldn't say possibly, they have already offered money to actually pay for the movement of their casino from downtown to a highway location because of what it's done to their downtown area. Then you look at other communities, they have a similar situation going on right now. From looking at those, as well as currently right now we have a wonderful neighbor up north to us, Beloit, and they are actually watching our process very closely, because right now as it sits, they obviously are it's going to decide which way they head up with it. Now, for obviously making sure that we protect the interest that we do have. We only have a 20% interest in this. Thanks to the state of Illinois legislation that actually gave us that 20%, they also gave 10% to Loves Park, City of Loves Park, and City of McChesney Park. And both of our other neighbors, Loves Park being the second biggest municipality in our community, has already voiced their opinion on this. Park District, as of Tuesday, has already voiced their opinion on this as well. And in that kind of regard, all this resolution is trying to make sure that we actually stay away from listening to the sales pitch of the operators, because in that moment, we put ourselves in a bad position of we might be the ones trying to tell City of Rockford who we want them to pick. And that's why I stay away from putting that resolution later on during that time. And that's why this resolution is up before you right now. This is actually a point where we can actually make a suggestion, a supportive suggestion, on where we believe that it's going to create the most revenue based off of data from other communities and data from other casinos as well.
Thank you, Mr. Billick. I think I saw Mr. Webster first and then Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you. In a way, it's kind of like, to me anyways, it's like putting the cart before the horse. We're voting on a location. That's all we're voting on is a location. And there was never any discussion about how you feel pro or con about a casino. So if that's what this is just your opinion about where this thing should be sited, yes, then I would have to say I would be in favor of putting it out by the interstate as well, for a number of reasons. But like I said, we missed ever having a discussion about, do we really want a casino? So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mrs. Gorel, I believe, was next, and then Mr. Gurl, then Mr. Salgado. Mrs. Gorel.
Is there any way, thank you, is there any way that we can just actually support the city, having a resolution supporting the city on, of them having a casino within the city of Rockford? Do we have to say the site? Can we just support them getting a casino here?
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is because of the legislation, because of what happened in Springfield, we have the ability to get a casino in the city of Rockford for the first time ever. And so that's not in question. That was in question prior to what happened in Springfield, but then they took action. Now we have an opportunity to get a casino inside the city limits of Rockford, is my understanding. So that's already a fait accompli. I guess you could say you support having a casino, but a casino is available for, it's available and achievable for the first time.
Or a site of their choosing?
It's my understanding, yes.
Pardon?
Yes.
Make an amendment to do it at a site of their choosing.
If I may add on to that, Angie,
Mr.
that was
Billick?
actually, I'm sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Angie, that was actually brought up in our committee, and it was actually, obviously a well-said point. One of the things that I try to reverberate multiple times is that we want to support our city and all of our municipalities within the county as much as we possibly can. That's what our job is. One of the things with this resolution, as far as the city's concerned, they're getting one already, and no matter what, we're in support of that. We were not part of a discussion I guess technically on the state side of it, if you spoke to your state legislatures, that would be the only conversation you had if you wanted to be against City of Rockford getting a casino or not. However, this is coming to the City of Rockford no matter what at this point. So for us, it kind of, one of the things that we're focusing on with this one is just, we picked a corridor. We specifically said an I-90 corridor, not an actual location, just to make sure that we are just trying to tell them we want to pick the best generator for the community. And we support them, no matter what their choice is. But this is just us supporting our constituents and also our other municipalities and saying we agree.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. And if I go out of turn here, I think it's Mr. Gurl and then Mr. Salgado, then Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Grohl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I have a quick question, but it's mostly a comment to Mr. Chairman Village. The city of Beloit in Wisconsin, do you know where their location for the casino might go?
On the I-90 corridor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grohl. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Village. Just quick question. From a practicality standpoint, I think from a county standpoint, we would like, I mean, from my perspective, since I'm looking at the budget and everything, I'd like to see the best source of revenue potentially. Has any studies been done, presented during the committee, based on, say, that led to the I-90 corridor? Because, you know, was there any studies done like, hey, if we move it to downtown, it would generate, I don't know, X amount of money? I know it's been in the press saying that, you know, they estimate X amount of money, millions of dollars that it would generate, but the likelihood between moving it on, you know, essentially the east side versus the west side versus the north or during the south along I-90 traffic, whatever the case may be, is there any statistics or data that was presented that obviously supports this? Because obviously from my standpoint, from a county standpoint, I'd like to obviously generate the most revenue we can, especially considering, you know, we have some budget constraints here. So not to say that we shouldn't put it on X side of, you know, whether it's downtown, the north, whatever the case may be. From this is a great opportunity, and Mr. Girl hit it right on the head too. The casino up in Beloit, they're looking at us. They have already said they're going to put it right along I-90. Which gives them the liberty to get the people from Madison, Rockford, you know, all over the place. So it makes it convenient in and out. So my question though is was there any data, any studies provided? I know you said that you went, you know, Aurora comparison to this that has a casino. Just statistics, data. Was there anything that was presented to the committee that kind of gave that decision the right direction, which is the I-90 corridor?
So in response to that, the conversation was had actually with other people as far as in regards to the city officials, in regards to what's the greater sales tax area revenue producer. That's when the conversation was said that it was towards the I-90 corridor or that end of State Street. It does produce along Perryville. I mean, we do have a lot of sales tax generating businesses there, and that's where a lot of them are concentrated, as well as a lot of the hotels. To the conversation about the other casinos and numericals and numbers, there was discussion about that. There was discussion that was also printed, like you said, in papers. And one of the things that like I said, this was brought up because from constituents and other people. And one of the things with the other individuals that could be involved as far as casino individuals, I think that they're wary on releasing the actual independent studies that their companies got because they paid tens of thousands of dollars for those. There was conversation that it is been already studied. I do know that there was also conversation about other casino that actually looked in the area, and they also studied it from the downtown perspective. Again, that's why I wanted to make sure that this resolution focused on the conversation we had with other officials and other people that actually basically said that is the corridor that we can make it on. During I believe when Loves Park and McChesney Park was looking at it, they also had that similar discussion, and it was also presented to them as well that we are looking at a large, within the many hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue possibly lost by these data points, and data points actually based off of Aurora and other examples as well.
Thank you, Mr. Billick. I have Mrs. Gorel on a follow-up. You didn't need, okay, and then Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you. Has anyone ever heard about this casino that's just over our border in Madison, Wisconsin, before you get into it? It's on I-90, and boy, does it make good money up there. In fact, Rockford people just love it because it's just a little bit over an hour drive up to the outskirts of Madison on I-90, and I believe they are the same ones who will be building the one, if they do, in Beloit. So they've already had the experience of knowing what it is to build on I-90. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Fellers on a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to clarify. people that spoke to us at Economic Development were 2 community leaders, a state senator, and a lawyer for one of the casinos, who was representing one of the casinos. I mean, we very much did not have a representative, and they didn't present any data. They presented why they said, they present anecdotes of Aurora's moving and Elgin's moving, but we haven't seen any data on anything. I'm just looking around, I'm curious who in this audience has ever planted a casino before, or ever operated a casino. I mean, that's my point here, is that it's not that I support one or the other. One might be better than the other, absolutely, but if we're going to make a decision, let's actually make a wise, measured one based on real data, not on what we think or what one side has obviously been very much pressuring us to do, right? And this doesn't have to come right away. We can take our time, figure out what the right decision to make is, and then actually come in when we actually do make a decision, we as a board can say, hey, we looked at both sides, we looked at the data, we looked at said, here's what casinos by highways do, here's what casinos in downtown do. And we can all come to a nice measured decision. We can have people come and present to us up here. They can present data from around the state on where they've planted casinos already and how those have done and what they're planning to do with it. But until, individual conversations and then board members repeating those conversations and treating them as if they are gospel is not the right way to do business. It's certainly not good government. Let's have the real experts come and talk to us about it. Let's bring the real experts in here so we can make a good decision. Thank you.
Just to clarify, the formal application process for this, I believe, ends at the end of this month. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Billick.
If I may just add a point of clarification on there.
Mr. Schultz, you're next. I apologize. Mr. Billick?
I think I might have forgot to actually mention it in my statement right before you made yours. But one thing we do have to respect for the city is the city has chosen to do this process. Now, I don't know if it was actually by their choice or not, or if somebody state mandated that they actually couldn't have this open as a conversation. Currently, anybody that's actually doing these, which have already done these independent studies, they cannot come forward to the city. They are wary to even send it to any of us or even show any of us specifically because they've paid thousands of dollars. But at the same time, we're also asking to look at studies from these casinos, which are independent studies. However, as respect to the city officials and respect to their process, this information cannot come out, obviously, for obvious reasons, because they cannot actually have that discussion right now.
Well, Mr. Fellers, hold 1 second. We'll let Mr. Billick finish.
It was just because they can't have a discussion in that perspective, so.
So why would we make a decision here? Why would we do anything?
Mr. Fellers, hold one.
We can't have real data on it.
Mr. Fellers, hold 1 second. Is there any other comments or questions? Mr. Schultz. Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, I understand I'm backing the train up a little bit here, but I do think that that's necessary. I appreciate, Mr. Haney, when you made your comments that you said that the legislature has provided for the first time the opportunity for a casino in Rockford. You did hedge on that or back up on that to say it in that way, and I think that was appropriate because it's not here yet. The legislator, I know that they've been pushing in the legislation, particularly some local folks, for a long time to get a casino here. But it is still an opportunity. And for us to say, I respectfully disagree with Mr. Billick, and I agree with Mr. Webster, it's not inappropriate for us to say whether or not we want a casino here. Because even though the legislation says it can happen, it's even gone so far as to say who will get what revenue from it. It doesn't mean that it has to happen. The legislature can't say you're going to have a casino in Rockford. It's silly, right? So I'm not saying that it isn't going to happen, but I do think it's troublesome when we say things like, well, it's going to happen. I actually, you all know where I stand on this, but I still hope that people who care about our community that sit on the Rockford board will say, no, we don't want it here. That the net is going to be a loss and not a gain. So that's just my respectful input.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schultz. I have Mr. Fiducia had his hand up, and then Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with Mr. Schultz on the city's priority, but a resolution basically is a suggestion. The city of Rockford is going to build that casino, or the developers are going to build it where they want to build it at. Now, a reasonable person would think that the I-90 corridor would be a good place to put it. But unfortunately, it's not going to be all of our decision. It's going to fall on the city of Rockford's decision. So they're basically going to put it where they want to put it. Now, a reasonable person would think that would be the spot where they're going to want it. But then a reasonable person would have thought that that NASCAR track should have been in our area too. So, you know, there's not a lot of reason in this area. So I think if we're just going to make a resolution where we think we want to suggest they do it, that's all we're doing is we're suggesting. We're not binding anything or not telling them what they think to do. It's just a suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Neighbors.
As Jazz put it, we respect the city of Rockford. And right now, we're in a good relationship with the city of Rockford. And to my understanding, the city of Rockford doesn't want our opinion on where it should go. And so just to keep that respect for the city of Rockford, because they know, the city of Rockford knows its city, knows its limitation, it knows that it needs to maximize the revenue, but it knows it needs to keep its citizens safe as well. So I think we should trust the city of Rockford in making its own decision on where they should put the casino and not place the resolution in the first place.
Thank you, Mr. Neighbors. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote would pass. A vote to support supporting the siting of a casino in the city of Rockford along the I-90 corridor. A no vote would leave, at this point, the county board silent on that particular topic. Clerk Gamow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby? No. Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman? But he's
Abstain.
But you need to say you're going to abstain, right? So for the
Yep,
record.
abstain.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Red? Yes. Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz?
No.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
And Mrs. Red? Yes.
Motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. Bellick.
That concludes our report for today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bellick. Next item of business, Operations Committee, Mr. McDonald.
No report, sir.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Is there if I may ask, is there a timetable here on I know you guys had a trustee discussion last week in committee, a robust discussion, and could you advise what the next step in that process is? Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did have a very good conversation about the trustee program last week. There's not a timetable to it, but it became very clear that we need to get the parties back in the room again to discuss more of the details. There is not a time frame to it, but there is an urgency to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Next item of business, Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. We have no report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni. Next item of business, Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. The Public Safety Committee brings forward two resolutions. Number one is a resolution authorizing execution of an intergovernmental cooperation agreement with the City of Rockford for the 2019 Burn Justice Assistance Grant Program Award. It went through committee, passed unanimously in committee, and any discussion on it?
Yes, so I'm going to take that as a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution to approve the IGA for the 2019 JAG Grant Award, which includes the City of Rockford for a portion and the county for a portion. I got a second by Mr. Butita, Mr. Billick, Mrs. Gorel, Mrs. Crosby. Thank you very much. The item is now before the board. And I heard you, Mr. Booker, as committee chair, say that this passed unanimously out of committee.
Yes. Do we need to bring this, do we need to suspend the rules to get this passed tonight?
No, I know there's urgency on behalf of our partners, but a resolution we can take action on the first time it comes to the board, so we're in good shape to take a vote this evening. If you allow me just to speak to this issue, this is a grant application process by the Regional Planning Council. It's a public safety related grant that the city of Rockford would get a large portion, the county would also get a portion. There is no commitment by the county to match and no restrictions in terms of the county having to make any financial obligations. Here's a process concern I have going forward. I just want to put on record, and this isn't an adversarial statement. This is just food for thought as we go forward. So 2 weeks ago tonight, the application process became complete. The people who are doing the process, that they only had 2 weeks to prepare, because when they drop a grant, there's a timetable. 2 weeks ago, it was ready for signature. It went to the city of Rockford on the 9th of this month, and their attorney reviewed it, and the mayor signed it on the 9th, and then it had to get the county signature. Because of our current process, there's the opinion that we cannot have, because this requires an MOU, just to be upfront, we're in this process where we had to wait for the next board meeting. The deadline that if we don't submit this tomorrow, we would lose the grant, which would affect the city of Rockford and, of course, affect our sheriff's department. I don't think that's the intent of the board at all. But the one thing I think is worthy of a discussion from a process standpoint, we're not talking about grants that require a match or MOUs that would make the board or the county beholden to certain commitments with partners. But when you have a non-financial obligation that is part of a process of a grant that is essentially free money, do we want to be a little more flexible where, just like I've signed this very grant in the past, the former chairman signed this grant, I'm not aware of a local elected official who couldn't expedite something of this nature. I understand when there's matching components, we need to have discussions, there needs to be board approval. We have had a history of having elected officials enter into IGAs and MOUs without the board's knowledge. Not really what I'm looking to do. However, we are really close on this one, and the amount of inconvenience I think we've caused our partners. Tomorrow, the running around that will occur to make sure this process gets done. They're under tight deadlines. It's kind of a complicated thing, and I think that this may be an exception to the process that we currently have in place. At least think about that as we go forward, and we can have that discussion. But I think it's a great opportunity for the county and the city and for public safety. Mr. Schultz.
I could be mistaken about this, but I'm fairly confident that this particular grant has come before the board. Maybe last year was an exception, but it's come many, many times to this board. And my caution on not having it come to the board is this is the first time I've seen it tonight. It just got voted on tonight, and that's troubling to me as well. But it does have real specificity as far as how the money's going to be used. And there are times in the past where grant awards have occurred where the specifics of where the money's going to be used, whether it's grant money or not, has been such that it would obligate us or position us so that we would have an obligation in the future based on how the money was going to be used. So I understand what you're saying. We really don't want to create problems for the process. But in this case, and others like it, I think we ought to have a review by this board.
Just to draw a point of distinction, there are grants where there's a matching component or an obligation. It is my clear understanding that is not the case in this instance. Mrs. Grohl. Oh, State's Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just address some of the issues regarding this document. So, Mr. Schultz, we were brought a document by the Sheriff's Department that they were given from the city for my office to review. It was not in proper format. It did not have the right signatories on it. It was a form document for the federal grant. So we worked with Mr. Carner. He got us a copy of the actual full grant, and Mr. Kurlinkis, along with other staff in the civil division of my office, prepared the appropriate resolution. But I do want all of you to know that the original document that the city had sent over to the sheriff's department was not in proper format. So we worked with the sheriff and Mr. Carter to make sure that we got it in the proper format, because there was a deadline. But by the time the sheriff got it, it took a day or so for us to get the document in proper format. So we talked to Mr. Booker about calling a special meeting tonight, because it was time sensitive, and to bring it to you. So that's why it's specified. The prior document had no specificity, and again, it did not have the correct signatories. It did not have a place for the chairman. It had a place for the district attorney. Well, we don't have a district attorney here, and I'm not the county signatory for county agreements. So I just wanted to share that information with all of you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Next item of business, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Next item is a resolution awarding proposals for inmate food services to the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department Corrections Bureau. This also passed through committee unanimously.
So we have a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution awarding proposals for inmate food services. I see several hands up. Mr. Westcott, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Girl, thank you very much. The item is now before the board. This has been a pretty big deal and a pretty long time coming. I see Mr. Carter from the Sheriff's Department, and I know Ann worked on this with their department over a period of time. Could somebody just give a quick, like 30-second, 1-minute overview just for the record? Would you like to?
Sure. Yeah, I think I can tackle that. Aramark has been serving Winnebago County Corrections since 2012. Bids were sent out nationally. Bids were accepted. And again, Aramark came in as the low bid. And also, they, did I leave that? They also provided, Aramark also provided $140,000 to provide additional trays and so on. So it sounds like they have come forward with a great desire to serve Winnebago County. Kudos to Ann Johnson Purchasing for working out these deals and accepting bids, and working with Aramark to get a cost savings for Winnebago County as well. So there's a cost savings and an additional $140,000 in trays that Aramark is going to provide Winnebago County Sheriff's Corrections Bureau.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. I see a hand up, Mrs. Squirrel.
Thank you, Chairman. You almost might want to let the board members know that this also covers the detention home. It's just not the jail. It's both. Thank you.
Very good point. Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Any other comments by board members? Any questions? Since it's a resolution, we go ahead and call a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously with one absent. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. That concludes our report.
Thank you. Next item of business, Personnel Policy Committee, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I would respectfully request that this board go into closed session to discuss a personnel matter.
So I got a motion by Mr. Fiducia to go to closed session. May I have a second? Mr. Boomer and Mr. Hoffman. Item is now before the board. All those in favor of going to closed session signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? No. I have 2 no votes. Note that Mrs. Crosby and Mr. Fellers voted no to go to closed session. All other members present voted yes. So we will go to closed session. We'll take literally 2-minute break and start up right away. So we'll clear the room minus the board and appropriate personnel. Yep. Yep. to Mr. Fiducia. Before I do that, there's no action taken in closed session. We are currently in session, in open session now, and I'll ask everybody to grab their seats and we'll continue on with the meeting. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have three items on the agenda to discuss this evening, and the first is an ordinance amending Section 2-89 of the County Code of Ordinances, appointment of department heads. This is a reconsideration, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the reconsideration of the Section 262, that is the Winnebago County Code authority to issue, excuse me, I got the wrong section here. An ordinance amending Section 289 of the County Code, the appointment of department heads under reconsideration. Second, Mr. Boomer. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Yes, Mr. Fellers.
I didn't say this last time, I'll say it now for the record. County boards have no business getting involved in personnel decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Any other comments by board members? Seeing none. I'm sorry, Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. Could you just give us a brief, which one this is?
Okay. Let me see if I can read it here to you. It's appointment of department heads. Appointment and reappointment of department heads shall be made in accordance with county code ordinance required by state statute. The county administrator and 2 county board members chosen by the caucus chairs of each party from one of each political shall review the performance in the appointment department heads for annual using a uniform evaluation system. So basically this is about reappointment of department heads.
Would this, just to be clear for the record, Mr. Kurlinkus, be about appointing department heads for the first time, as well as potential dismissal, as well as an annual review? I think it's a 2-part thing. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, Chairman. Basically, the change is in the determination of who is going to make the appointment or reappointment of department heads, and it just puts it in the hands of the county board and the county administrator.
So then, just to follow up for clarity on the record, a particular point of concern is that we would, on an annual basis, have our caucus chairs appointing members with the county administrator to do some type of annual review, which would, just by doing basic math, as you would have the county administrator as professional staff and then a couple of county board members doing a review and bringing county board members into the operational process. That was one of the basis for the concern that I personally had. But I did want to note for the record that it would be the caucus chairs appointing a member of their caucus to sit on that sit in that process with the administrator on an annual review of the department heads, as well as appointing and recommending appointment and dismissal. Any other questions on this item? Yes, Mr. Kelly.
Just to clarify, I understand that a yes vote would support the ordinance and a no vote would repeal the ordinance.
Yes. It is a yes vote passes it. Since this is reconsideration, it's just like 2 weeks ago. A yes vote passes, a no vote declines passage of this. So if you want to see this go forward, vote yes. If you do not want to see this go forward, vote no. Any other discussions? Again, I appreciate any time it's not clear, somebody clarifies that. What I would ask, since this is an ordinance, is that for all members that are opposed to this motion, please raise your hand. I have Mr. Booker, I have Mr. Kelly, I have Mr. Fellers, Mr. Butita, and Mrs. Crosby. So those 5 members are casting a yes vote, and all other members present cast a yes vote. Excuse me, all 5 of those members, Mr. Booker, Kelly, Fellers, Butita, and Mrs. Crosby, cast no votes for the record. All other board members present cast a yes vote, so the reconsideration passes and will go forward and is officially adopted. Thank you very much for the discussion. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is an ordinance amending section 2-168 of the County Code of Ordinances, Human Resources Director, and this is a reconsideration. And just so you're aware, this is the ordinance that is giving the county administrator the power or the authorization to go ahead and hire that position.
Let's get the motion on the floor, and then we'll discuss it. So we got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on an ordinance amending Section 2-108 of the County Code of Ordinances, Human Resource Director, on a reconsideration basis. Second, thank you, Mr. Boomer and Mrs. Gorel. Item is now before the board. Mr. Kurlinkus, if it's okay, can I just get a clarification as to what a yes vote would be clarifying and putting into practice?
Thank you, Chairman. What this does is put the, currently the Human Resources Director can only be dismissed, recommended, appointed, or dismissed by the chairman with the advice and consent of the county board. This simply changes that to make the recommendation, appointment, discipline, or dismissal of the, by the Chief of Human Resources, if we have one, or the county administrator with the approval of the county board. In the absence of the administrator and the Chief Human Resource Officer, the Human Resources Director shall be recommended, appointed, disciplined, or dismissed by a majority vote of the board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurlinkus. I did see a hand. Mr. Webster.
Yes, call the question, please.
We have a motion to call the question. May I have a second? A second by Mr. Westcott and Mrs. Gorel and Mr. Salgado. That would end discussion. A yes vote on calling the question would end discussion and allow the vote to be taken separately right after that. What we will do is ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote just ends discussion. If you vote yes, you're voting to end discussion. If you vote no, we would continue with the discussion. It is not the official vote on this ordinance. So a yes vote would end discussion. Clerk Gummow.
Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Rudd?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz? Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Booker?
Yes.
So motion passes. We're suspended the rules. Now we'll take the vote on this ordinance. A yes vote would pass the ordinance. A no vote would repeal the ordinance, would stop the ordinance from going through. Since it's an ordinance, I'm going to ask any board members who are opposed to this motion going forward to please raise your hand. And for the record, it's the same five from the last vote, which would be Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Butita, Mr. Fellers, Mr. Kelly, and Mr. Booker are no votes. All other board members present, we will cast a yes vote for them, with our one person, Mr. Arenas, being absent. So motion passes. We've now adopted the ordinance amending Section 2108. And we'll turn things back over to Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is a motion to accept the recommendation of the county administrator to dismiss a county employee, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Fiducia. I do have just a quick point of order question for the state's attorney, if that's okay.
No problem.
So since this is a motion and not a resolution or an ordinance, I believe by the ordinance, I can ask for this in writing. Is that correct, Mr. Kurlinkus?
That is correct, Chairman.
Okay, so I'd just like this to be in this motion in writing, if that's okay.
Can we do it now?
I'll defer to the state's attorney on how that process would be.
We can do it currently, or we can do it afterwards, Chairman.
So then would it be okay then to entertain a motion, or entertain a motion on the resolution to accept the recommendation? My understanding from the ordinance is that, and by state law, under the at-large elected chairman, that motions that are in writing are resolutions or ordinances. That is my clear understanding from looking at the state code and also the local code, or the county code.
That is correct.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Fellers, hold on one second. I just want to make sure procedurally we're handling this the appropriate way. And I'm going on good faith, Mr. Salgado's writing that up. So the motion to accept, the resolution to accept the recommendation of the county administrator to dismiss a county employee is a motion by Mr. Fiducia. Is that correct, sir?
You're correct on that.
Okay, so we have a resolution to accept the recommendation. That resolution is currently being written up by Mr. Salgado. Graciously, thank you, of the county administrator to dismiss a county employee. May I have a second on that motion? The second is by Mrs. Gorel.
I've got both points of order, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and that item now is before the board. I'll go to Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a few points of order on this one. Number one, that motion, according to Robert's Rules of Order, should be written up in the form of I resolve, and that's for as a resolution. Should we pass it, it is also still a resolution, which means that we have not given proper notification under OMA, because this is still has to go through a resolution. Hold on, Mr. Kurlinkis. We are also violating our normal procedure, operational procedure, by not putting a resolution through committee and then putting it up before the board, which will put us in risk for another OMA violation. And then finally, when Ms. Pascal, the administrator, made this recommendation, she did not have the authority to, so therefore we don't have the authority to act on it.
So the points of order.
My points of order is that this is entirely out of line. It's designed to circumvent the chairman's reconsideration process. If Mr. Fiducia and the Personnel and Policy Committee wanted to do this the right way, they would have submitted a resolution through the Personnel and Policies Committee. They would have voted on it, and we'd be voting on that resolution here in committee. However, because that recommendation was also made before the administrator had the authority to make that recommendation, because until tonight, it was the chairman's authority to make that recommendation, we can't act on it anyway.
Mr. Chairman, may I address this for a second?
Yes, just one second, Mr. Fiducia. I just want to see if Mr. Kurlinkis had anything to add to that.
Certainly. First of all, if you take a look at 2-48 of your Rules of Order and Procedure, you'll notice that the chairman has the ability to act on reconsideration for any ordinance, resolution, or motion. Okay, so that's number one. All right. The motion was declared properly and considered properly before a committee. Okay? Personnel and Policy. All right? It was forwarded to the board. The public has notice. Public has notice because it's an agenda item, an action item on an agenda. Okay? Now, the fact that you want to reduce a motion to writing, I don't believe makes it a resolution, number one. And number two, it's been reduced to writing, so that takes care of that. Number three, the fact that the county administrator made the recommendation at a time before this ordinance was reconsidered really has no bearing at all, because the ordinance was reconsidered before this vote. I believe those address your points of order.
Same point of order. A motion that passes therefore becomes a resolution. Again, I don't understand why we are not just simply voting on the resolution that would have been passed through Personnel and Policies Committee making this action. On the other hand, I'm back to the other point. If you don't have the authority to make a recommendation, how is that recommendation valid?
Because the recommendation wasn't accepted until the authority was granted.
But again, the recommendation was made by someone who didn't have the authority to make the recommendation. And all I'm saying is, we are setting ourselves up for a massive payday for the employee in question. That's all I got to say.
The separate point of order that you raised Mr. Fellers, was related to how the agenda item is placed on the agenda. I want to understand that. What is the specific concern?
If a resolution passed through Personnel and Policy Committee, it should be on this agenda as a resolution by the Personnel and Policy Committee, right? And it should have been in writing because it came through there, and I'm assuming it came through Personnel and Policy in writing as well. Therefore, it would not be proper notice because we are now moving on a separate motion from what went through Personnel and Policy.
I'll ask the state's attorney a question related to the notice piece. Motion or resolution aside for a second, do you have concern over how this was noticed in terms of the language, motion or resolution recommending the county administrator to dismiss an employee versus the specific citing of an employee's name in terms of noticing this from an OMA standpoint? Belenkus.
I'm not aware what your question is, Chairman.
Is this properly noticed in that we're providing the public adequate clarity as to what we're voting on this evening on the dismissal of a county employee versus the specific name of a county employee? That's my specific question related to OMA.
I believe it is.
Any follow-ups, Mr. Fellers, on your objections? Okay, I see Mr. Boomer, then I have Mr. Salgado. Mr. Boomer. You'll defer? We'll defer to Mr. Salgado. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I approach? I'd like to give you the written notice motion, so we can move forward.
Follow up, Mr. Boomer. We'll give him a minute.
I can read it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It indicates written notice of motion, August 22nd, 2019. I, County Board Member Jaime Salgado, motion to accept the reconsideration of the county administrator to dismiss a county employee. Best regards, signed Jaime Salgado, printed Jaime J. Salgado, County Board Member, District 12. I'll pass that to you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Salgado, any follow-up?
No, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Boomer. So we have a motion to call the question, which would end discussion on this item. Do we have a second? We have a second by Mr. Westcott. So the item is now before the board, and the motion and the second is to call the question, which would end the discussion and allow us to vote separately on this action. The motion, again, a yes vote would end discussion. A no vote would allow the discussion to continue. So with that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. And again, a yes vote calls the question, ends discussion. A no vote would continue the discussion. Clerk, I'm out.
Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Fellers? Been a long night. How about Mrs. Crosby? Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Huffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Motion passes. Two and one absent.
Motion passes. We have called the question, which would end discussion on this topic, and then we would have our vote. That'll be the next item of business. A yes vote would be the accept the recommendation of the county administrator to dismiss a county employee. Yes. Yes, we have a point of order, if you'll allow, by Mr. Kalinkas.
If I could just, I wanted to make sure that I addressed Mr. Feller's point of order. Even under the unamended ordinance, the one that was overridden tonight, the recommendation for termination would still be the county administrators. It was recommended to the chairman, so she did have the authority to make that. I should have called it to your attention earlier. I apologize. Appreciate it.
With that, the other piece of business just that I asked the attorney, just for the record, is that I did ask on the ability to my ability to lay this item over, and he indicated I'm not able to lay this item over, just for the record. With that, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll per the calling of the question. So a yes vote would affirmatively pass the item before you with a yes vote. A no vote would be a vote against this action. Clerk Gummow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fellers? No. Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gurl?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
I recuse myself.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Butita?
I'm going to abstain.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
$13 yes, 4 no, 2 abstention, 1 absent, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Clerk Gummow. Motion passes. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's animal stories. Animal Services had 938 calls for service. 605 of them were at Rockford, 143 were in incorporated Winnebago County. 71 were McChesney Park, 56 Loves Park, 12 Rockton, 17 Roscoe, 17 South Beloit, Durand had 3, Peck had 1, the Village of Winnebago 6, New Milford 1, and Cherry Valley 6. We took 186 dogs and catch this number, 274 cats. And we had 1 guinea pig and 4, one pig, an actual pig, 4 parakeets and 4 guinea pigs. We adopted, I know, Mr. Hoffman, I don't know what to tell you. We adopted out 98 dogs.
I'm going to hold you 1 second, Mr. Fiducia. Let's let Mr. Fiducia finish his report, if that's okay. He has the floor, Mr. Fiducia.
We had 98 dogs, 151 cats were adopted, and the 2 guinea pigs and 2 parakeets, and I don't know the fate of the pig at this time. So that concludes my report. Thank you so much.
Any unfinished business? Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you. If you remember last week when we had the joint meetings in regards to the trustee program, and I had promised you would all have copies of the map, all the addresses. You'll also have the market value of these properties. And Tom Hodges has been very busy because he just sent out all of the assessments that you will be getting that. He will be emailing all of this to you for your information. So you'll all have information in regards to what properties are in the trustees program.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Any other discussion under unfinished business? Any new business by board members? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. I have a motion by Mr. Hoffman, a second by Mr. Butita, Mr. Billings. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Have a good evening. Thank you.
Steve.